It's wonderful having all of you here today for what's one of my favorite lecture series. Many of you are very conversant in the First Amendment, and if I were to give a quiz in the room about what the 6 fundamental freedoms protected by the First Amendment are, I'm sure all of you would score 100s on those 6, right? But 2 of the 6 that have been really dearest to the hearts of Baptists historically for 400 years now, well, for 200 years since we've had these 2, have been the clauses protecting us from government-imposed religion and the clause guaranteeing the free exercise of religion by individuals. The clause protecting us from government-imposed religion is the clause that was at issue in the school prayer cases where the United States Supreme Court held that the government could not impose government-sanctioned prayers on school children, which seems to me to be a good thing. And the free exercise clause is the clause that guarantees that individual school children have the right to offer prayers that they have crafted themselves throughout the school day, a right exercised by millions of children every day all across the country. Very important clauses found in the First Amendment to the United States. They're not the only provisions of our Constitution designed to protect religious freedom. The Constitution also contains a provision that's become very material in the presidential election, prohibiting any religious test for public office in the United States. And that, of course, is the clause that has provoked some discussion in evaluating the relevance of Governor Romney's Mormon beliefs in assessing his qualifications for office. A pretty easy question in my judgment. It's quite clear that Congress couldn't pass a law prohibiting a Mormon from serving as president, and it's equally clear that an individual voter is free to consider the fact that Governor Romney's a Mormon to the extent that that voter believes that that's of some relevance to assessing how he would conduct himself as president. I don't know if Brent and I agree on that, but that's certainly my view. So lots of really intriguing issues presented by these protections against government-imposed religion and the free exercise of religion. And I think the organization in this country that provides the most thoughtful source of analysis of religious freedom issues as they arise has been the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Not only a thoughtful analysis of religious liberty issues as they arise, but a very forceful advocate for religious liberty. The head of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty is a good friend of the university, someone who's been here many times, Brent Walker, who I consider to be the leading expert on religious liberty in the country. And with him today is his right arm, Holly Holloman, and it's great having you all here once again to present the Sheridan Lectures. And of course, our own Buddy Sheridan has been among the greatest advocates of religious liberty in this country, and we're grateful to Buddy for making the Sheridan Lecture Series possible here at Mercer and at other Baptist colleges around the country. So Buddy, we're grateful to you and Kay for making this series possible. Brent, would you like to introduce our speaker today?
Yeah, thank you, President Underwood. I might add right up front, a Baptist Joint Committee intern, 1981. We are indeed pleased to co-sponsor with Mercer University the 7th annual Sheridan Lectures on Religious Liberty and the Separation of Church and State, the 3rd time the lectures have been presented on this campus. Thanks for the good words about the Baptist Joint Committee, Bill. We've been at it, 76 years now, defending and extending religious liberty, not just for Baptists, but for all of God's children. And we file briefs in the Supreme Court, we pressure Congress, we advocate in the agencies. We give commentary to the media. We advise the administration. Publish a monthly magazine, Report from the Capitol, which you can find copies of out front, and I hope you'll sign up to receive that every month. Administer a state-of-the-art website and a web blog, and you can follow us on all of the social media as we work day in and day out to be your voice in Washington, D.C. I also want to introduce Jeff Hewitt, who's with us today, our Director of Communications at the Baptist Joint Committee, who does work with the media and gets our message out in other venues. He does a great job, and as Bill said, Holly Holman, one of the leading church-state experts and advocates in our nation's capital, she makes you proud every day doing our work on Capitol Hill, in the court, the Congress, and the White House. I also want to add my expression of gratitude to Buddy and Kay Sheridan, whose incredible generosity has made these lectures possible year in and year out, not just at Mercer, but campuses around the country. And because it is an endowment, it will continue to be so in perpetuity. So long after we are gone from the face of the earth, all of us in this room, even the young students, these lectureships will be continuing to announce the importance of religious liberty and how critical the concept of the separation of church and state is to ensure the religious liberty for all of us. I hope you will be able to attend all three of the lectures this week, today and tomorrow, delivered by Dr. Frank Lambert. A summary of his ample CV is in the program, so I will be brief, but Dr. Lambert is a professor of history at Purdue University, earning his PhD from Northwestern University, master's degrees from the University of Louisville and Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BA from the University of Mississippi. Prior to embarking on his teaching career, Dr. Lambert held numerous positions in business and in government, and not the least, he was a punter for the Pittsburgh Steelers. How about that? Dr. Lambert, you're the first of our Sheridan lecturers who had a career in professional football before coming to the lectern. In addition to many articles, chapters in books and book reviews, Dr. Lambert has authored 7 books, including 2 that I am sure will form some of the basis for his lectures today and tomorrow. Entitled The Founding Fathers and the Place of Religion in America, published 2003, and Religion in American Politics, a Short History in 2008. And his most recent effort, The Battle of Ole Miss, Civil Rights versus States' Rights, published in 2010. Dr. Lambert, we welcome you to campus and to this lectern. Mrs. Lambert, Beth Lambert, so good to have you with us today as well. You will find this a friendly and eager audience, so we anxiously await the first lecture titled America Conceived as a Christian Nation, the Separation of Good and Bad History. Wow, we're in for a treat. Thank you, Dr. Lambert.
I hope you can hear me okay. I am currently imbibing your wonderful hospitality and apparently your pollen. So there may be some issues along the way. Well, let me make it a trifecta and thank Kay and Buddy for endowing this series. It's my honor to be a part of it. And I would like to thank the people from the Baptist Joint Committee, Brent and Jeff and Holland, and President Underwood. Thank you for having me here. In the early 70s, I went to the seminary in Louisville. That was before the lights went out. And I think it was the second year that I was there. This guy came in, a visiting professor from Carson Newman, and taught a course in Baptist history. I grew up Baptist, so I thought maybe I ought to know something about the denomination. And, of course, it was Buddy. And Buddy Sheridan is a great professor, and I don't say that lightly. And I'll tell you how I define a great professor. It's somebody who inspires. It's somebody who challenges people to think. And what he did for me was to introduce me to a topic, and I really did not know this at the time, but a topic that would engage my intellectual and scholarly interest for the past 20 years or so. He also stressed the importance of historical investigation, how you go about making the claims that you make about the past. So what you're going to get today is a good bit of warmed over Sheridan. So if you take shots at me, you probably are going to hit Buddy. In all fairness, Buddy and I would characterize our approaches to history as different but complementary. Buddy approaches history of church and state religious freedom from within a confession and from within a system, a belief system. I approach it as the intersection of religion, really as an outsider, the intersection of religion and American public life, American institutions, be it religion and politics, religion and commerce, religion and culture. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a preacher, I'm a historian. Not that those are mutually exclusive, but I'm just telling you who I am. I think it is, at one point you could say, why do we need to talk about separation of church and state and religious liberty again? Unfortunately, those topics are rendered relevant today because of a concerted effort to refashion history in this country and to rewrite it. And we've seen it in the recent Republican races where separation of church is absolutely denied, making the silly argument that I will return to in a moment, the argument from silence, and that is, well, it's that phrase, separation of church and state, is not in the Constitution, therefore we don't have separation of church and state. More about that later. So I think it's important that we revisit the history of separation of church and state. How did that come about? Religious liberty, and what have you. I'd like to begin, however, by looking at what, from my perspective, the opposition have to say about our subject. And this comes from the so-called evangelical historians. I don't like that title. They are ultra-conservative, ultra-right-wing, highly partisan, sectarians. They're not historians, as we will see in a moment, but they have all the answers. One does not have to engage in historical investigation. The answers are self-evident. Now, the reason I don't like the title evangelical historians, I think it besmirches the good names of both evangelicals and historians. But let's begin by examining, and I think we should do so fairly. I mean, let's restate what the evangelical historians are saying, because they make three claims, and I'm going to use each of these claims as the basis for the three lectures. Number one, America was founded as a Christian nation by Christian men on Christian principles. They reject any suggestion that secular ideas and secular concerns had anything at all to do with what happened in 1787. Rather, they contend the delegates at the Federal Convention were guided more by Calvin than by Montesquieu. An absolutely stunning assertion. All one has to do is a keyword search on the records of the Federal Convention, and guess how many times Calvin pops up? 0. Or Calvinism, 0. Montesquieu, 13 times. And Montesquieu's ideas many more times than that. And they say that the founders were guided by two models. One, The Bible, government as depicted in the Bible, and they see it as a tripartite, separate, legislative, judicial, and executive branch that to me is a stretch, but anyway. And they're guided by the Puritan model on the hill, the city on the hill. We'll come back to that one in a moment. The second claim that they make is that modern-day liberals and secularists, for purposes here today, let's call Buddy a liberal, and I'll take the role of the secularist. Especially, they pick on academic historians, and I'm guilty. We're the ones, apparently, who have distorted the place of religion in American society. And in fact, they accuse us of attacking religion in America. And so they want to set the record straight. And theirs is a restorationist approach. They want to go back to the nation's founding as they conceive it, and they will find there, surprise, surprise, a Christian republic, and then we have gone to hell in a handbasket because of people like Buddy and me. The third claim, separation of church and state, is a myth. It's a myth that is created by, surprise, same people, liberals and secularists. Phrase does not appear in the Constitution, therefore it is a fabrication. Now, what's at stake here? It seems to me a great deal. A great deal of what President Underwood talked about, we hold very dear, the principle of religious liberty. And it seems to me that that is grounded in separation of church and state. If the two are conjoined, if government gets a say in religion, one day the government might be saying what you want to hear, and you may say, great, government is promoting my kind of religion. Tomorrow, or the next administration, it might be a totally different story. So separation of church and state is a safeguard of religious liberty. But what else is at stake, it seems to me, is history itself. What produced those three claims by the evangelical historians, quite frankly, is bad history. Not all history is alike. Now, I'm certainly not saying that one has to have a PhD in history in order to write good history. I'm not saying that at all. There's been some great history written by people without PhDs in history. However, if you're going to have good history, you have to follow the tenets, the sound tenets of historical investigation. You can't just go fabricating history. Well, I'm going to mention four names here of these so-called evangelical historians, and I'm going to just mention a bit about their educational background. You will see not one of them has any training in history. Forget about the PhD. Let's go to a major or a minor. The first is Tim LaHaye, co-founder of the so-called Moral Majority. He has a BA from Bob Jones and a D-Min from Western Seminary. And he pontificates on the founding of this country, and he has George Washington and the rest of them, thumping Bibles and proclaiming their evangelical beliefs. David Barton from Texas. He is founder of the so-called Wall Builders. There's really little, he's very careful not to say much about his education, probably good reason. He has a BA from Oral Roberts. He, like Tim LaHaye, highly involved in the most conservative wing of the Republican Party, highly involved in the Tea Party. Now, I'm not here today and tomorrow to attack anybody's political views. I'm not here to attack the Republicans or the Democrats. I'm an equal opportunity critic of both, quite frankly. But my point is, rather than being historians, these are partisans. And when they write as partisans, not as historians who are trying to understand and explain history in context. Third, William Federer. He has a degree in accounting at St. Louis University. I have nothing against accounting. It's wonderful. It ain't history. And it doesn't prepare one to do historical investigation. He is also a failed Republican candidate for Senate in 2000. And then finally, there's John Eidsmoe. He has a D-Min from ORU. He has a law degree from Iowa, an MA from Dallas Theological Seminary, and an MDiv from Lutheran Brethren. But he writes about history. And he's the one that contends it's not Montesquieu, it's not Locke, it is John Calvin, who really shaped the thoughts of the founders. Now, as we've seen in the Republican campaigns, a lot of this stuff that they are writing is surfacing in the campaigns. Some of it is silly, some of it is embarrassing. I mean, Michelle Bachmann. When Michelle Bachmann ran, when she was in the race, she acknowledged that her guru at Oral Roberts was Eidsmoe. She was a research assistant for Eidsmoe. And remember, she's the one who lectured us on how hard the founding fathers had worked to free the slaves. What? I mean, has she read any document at all? They worked very hard, and it's expressed in the Constitution, to protect property. And they found an effective way to do that without even mentioning the word slave. And then, of course, there is Sarah Palin. She's not running. I have no idea where she gets her history. But she's got Paul Revere running through Boston making loud noises to warn the British. The idea was to warn the good guys, you know, and to be stealthy going through Boston, not to go clamoring and waking up. And she said, oh, well, what he really was doing was putting the British on notice. You better not mess with us. Okay. And then, and I do this with some trepidation, there's Newt Gingrich. And I know he's a Georgian. I know he's a native son. I am not attacking Newt. I am not attacking Newt's policies, although politics, I disagree with a lot of them, but I'm not attacking those. But Newt ought to know better. Newt has a PhD in history from Tulane. He was educated to do sound historical investigation, and he does not. If you look at what he writes as a partisan, not as a historian. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But it should be read as a partisan treatise, not as history. For example, he contributed to a book entitled The New Reagan Revolution, How Ronald Reagan's Principles Can Restore American Greatness. That sort of tells you this might be partisan. And in there, he talks about how Republicans line up with the Founding Fathers. So we got the Founding Fathers with pure principles, Republicans, pure principles, and they get all of that from God. So you got God, founders, Republicans, Reagan, Gingrich. It's a great genealogy, but I'm not so sure it stacks up. Okay, so how do we judge good history from bad history? And why do I make the rather bald claim that these guys are practicing bad history? Well, History 101 talks about how one goes about doing historical investigation, and let me just go through that fairly rapidly. First of all, good history begins by asking a question. Was America conceived as a Christian nation, or maybe a Christian state? If so, in what sense? You ask questions. You don't start, as these guys do, with assertions. America was created or conceived as a Christian nation. If you have the answer, all you have to do is go find evidence to support your answer. It's presuppositional history. It's history by assertion. Secondly, good history looks at evidence within historical context. Within historical context. It matters what happened then if you're going to interpret the past. Not what happens today and then read that back into the past. Let me give you an example. There's a bill before the House of Representatives, you guys know more about it than I do, I'm sure, House Bill 4182. And House Bill 4182 is the brainchild of David Barton. And Michelle Bachmann's one of the 40 or 41 co-sponsors. And it's a bill that would put a plaque in the U.S. Capitol in Washington stating that there was a time when the founders not only allowed worship services in the Capitol building, they attended them, and the implication is that proves that at one time the founders were for this close, cozy relationship between church and state. Totally ignores context. Were there worship services in the Capitol building? Yes. They were there when there were no other churches in Washington. Washington was a mud hole. Washington was a backwater. If you're going to have government, if you're going to have people who are going to come there and serve the country, you got to have institutions for them. So when people wanted to worship, yeah, you can use one of the rooms close to the House or one of the rooms close to the Senate. And yes, Jefferson, Madison, others attended there. Does that say that Madison and Jefferson said that there ought to be no separation of church and state? No way. But that is taking history out of context. Third, good historians are careful not to overstate their conclusions. That is, go beyond where the evidence supports, what the evidence supports. I mean, historical actors themselves wrestle with interpretation. For example, John Adams said that the American Revolution began in 1763. It began in the minds of Americans as they made a switch of loyalty from the king to the people, to a republic. Gouverneur Morris said, no, the American Revolution began after the War of Independence. That's when it really began. So historical actors themselves interpret their own events and what those events mean differently, and therefore historians had better be very careful in reading evidence and making sure that they get it right. Fourth, good historians acknowledge up front their biases and try to check them at the door. Tell my students, my PhD students all the time, check your biases at the door of your study. It's tough to do. We all have biases. I have biases, of course. But you very consciously try to set those aside and as best you can conduct investigation in a fair way. And that means that you've got to give voice to people, historical actors that you don't particularly care for. You've got to give voice to historians you don't particularly care for or you disagree with their interpretations. That's part of it. You can't just say, well, you know, I've got my interpretation, it's the only possible interpretation. No way. Fifth, good history captures the contingent nature of the past. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that as history is lived, the historical actors do not know how it's going to turn out. George Washington, for example, predicted that the new Constitution would last maybe 20 years. And he had good reason to believe that. I mean, the previous Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, lasted barely 5. So these are people who are living history. I mean, as we live today, we don't know how things are going to turn out. You know, some historian 200 years from now is going to look back and say, those people in 2012 were blind, dumb, stubborn. How could they not see what was in front of them? So good historians try to capture the contingency of the moment. Sixth, good history looks at all the evidence and acknowledges even that evidence that does not agree with the writer's argument. Let me tell you how these evangelical historians make their case that America is a Christian nation. They find every possible quote that has anything to do with religion from the people they regard as the founding fathers. And by the way, that phrase, the founding fathers, is an invention in itself. It doesn't appear until the early 1920s, and it was used in partisan politics. President Harding, or presidential candidate Harding, used that. But it's very convenient, because if I'm running for president, I want to identify with those demigods, as Jefferson called the delegates in 1787. I want to identify with those lofty principles. And then, of course, I'm going to tell the world that my opponents have not embraced those lofty principles. And then finally, good history follows the rules of logic in presenting evidence. And let me return to one of the logical fallacies that we hear on this business that there's no separation of church and state. And that is the argument that, well, the phrase does not appear in the Constitution. True, but guess what? Neither does democracy. Does that mean we don't have a democracy? Federalism does not. Republic does not. God does not. States' rights does not. Separation of powers does not. Checks and balances, slaves, Christian, conservative, liberal, judicial review. None of those words appear in the Constitution. But it doesn't mean that, that principles aren't there. Clearly there's separation of powers between the three branches, between the federal government and the state government, and I maintain between the civil and the ecclesiastical parts of society. Finally, good history is fully vetted before it's published. It goes through a rigorous process, first at the publisher's examination, sending it out to readers, then after it's published, reviews and what have you. It is a rigorous process. It doesn't mean that the end product is pure. It doesn't mean that there aren't mistakes. It doesn't mean that those interpretations are correct. But it means that it has been put through a rigorous examination. Okay, enough about good and bad history. I now want to turn to the first of the claims put forward by these evangelical historians, and that is that America was conceived of as a Christian nation. If you look at the terms conservative evangelicals, and that's what these guys talk about over and over and over. We're conservative, so are the founders. We're evangelical, so were the founders. Again, if you do a keyword search of the constitutional and ratifying conventions, conservative comes up 0 times. Evangelical comes up 0 times. Liberal comes up 39 times. Enlightenment comes up 27 times. The delegates referred to themselves over and over as liberal and enlightened, not conservative evangelicals. So it raises the question, whose language are we hearing from these guys? The language of the founders or the language of these historians, excuse me, I keep saying historians, these partisans. There is, in fact, an example of a Christian state conceived in America, in British North America. And that, of course, is the Christian Commonwealth, or it was sometimes referred to as the Holy Commonwealth, or even the Bible Commonwealth, in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So what I would like for us to do is to visit or revisit Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Christian Commonwealth so that we can get an understanding of what a Christian state looks like. What are its institutions? What are its purposes? How does it function? And then maybe we can get some idea of what a Christian state is, and perhaps more importantly, would you really want to live there? So let's take a look at it. From 1629, the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony, to 1684, the revocation of the charter by Charles II, one could argue that Massachusetts Bay Colony was, in fact, a holy commonwealth. John Winthrop was a very shrewd lawyer, and John Winthrop had a charter from the Crown saying you can charter, you Puritans can go to New England and charter a colony. Now, Winthrop was shrewd, very good lawyer. He examined the charter given him. There was a clause missing, and it was the clause that mandated that the Massachusetts Bay Company headquarters be in London under the close oversight of the Crown. If you look at the Virginia charter, for example, the Virginia Company had to be located right there so the Crown could keep an eye on it. So he says, aha, we're going to take our charter with us, we're going to have our headquarters in Boston, and we're going to be able to do our own thing and design the kind of colony that we want. They also got lucky because of events going on in England. Throughout the 17th century in England, there's civil war. So English political leaders, including kings, are preoccupied with what's going on on the ground in England. And so for a 30 or 40 year period, New England, Massachusetts Bay Colony, is allowed to do whatever it wants. So Winthrop has his charter with him, and he sets forth the purpose of this new charter, and without question, the purpose was to create a Christian commonwealth, a Christian state. He laid that out in his sermon, Model of Christian Charity. It was a utopian ideal based on mutual love, and that love would override all differences, including class differences. It rested on a covenant between God and the people of Massachusetts. And right in the sermon he says that a covenant has been drawn up. And it's a conditional covenant. God will bless us and we'll be his people, we'll be the new Israel, as long as we submit to the laws of God, as long as we obey. So this is a Christian covenanted community. And the result, if we're obedient, he said, would be a city upon the hill. This would be a beacon to Protestants around the world. This would show everybody how to build a community based on biblical precepts, a Christian commonwealth. Well, let's look at the design. It was based on a few key principles, and the first one is most important, and that is the principle of religious uniformity. Religious uniformity. Now, while the Puritans were embarking upon a noble experiment, it was not a departure from what they left in England, that is, the notion of religious uniformity. They were just substituting their beliefs, their congregational Calvinist beliefs, for the church, for those of the Church of England. But the idea was there must be religious uniformity. Now, they define religious freedom in an interesting way. Religious freedom meant freedom from error. We're going to have a community where it's the pure religion. It's our religion. It's the religion of the Bible, intermixed with nothing else. And those who agree with us, who subscribe to that, are welcome. Those who do not are free to leave. Nathaniel Ward was a Puritan minister. I love the way he put it. He said Anabaptists and Quakers and Familists and what have you are not welcome here, and they are free to go, and the sooner the better. I like that kind of tolerance, don't you? You know, just get out. Scripture would be the blueprint of this society, including a blueprint for politics and economics. More about that in a moment. Church and state were in fact separated, but closely related, interrelated, I should say. And sovereignty rested with, quote, visible saints, unquote. That is, people who could satisfy their neighbors that they had indeed been elected by God to salvation. They were the ones who, and the only ones, who could vote. And I'm talking about vote in civil society. They're the only ones who could hold office in civil society. More about that in a moment. Now let's look at how this state, this commonwealth, actually functioned. How did it work? Well, I think first of all, we have to say there's much to admire about Puritan Massachusetts Bay. Much to admire. Number one, it was a society knitted by love. Disputes were to be solved by loving mediation. At least that was the ideal. Before you then sued the heck out of your neighbor. You try to work it out, and then the next appeal would be to the congregation, to the visible saints, and then only as a last resort do you turn to the courts. Secondly, it rested on covenants and consent. Covenants and consent. And certainly at the local level, there was a great deal of democracy through the town meetings. In other words, if you were a part of this closed, covenanted Christian community, you had a great deal of freedom. You had a great deal of voice. Third, it promoted education at every level, from elementary right through Harvard. Fourth, it prospered, and it prospered in large part because of the so-called Puritan or Protestant work ethic. I tell my kids, look, my students, undergraduate students, I teach history. How can you make any money off of history? Give me a break. But I try to throw out a few jewels, and one jewel is this: follow the Puritan ethic, and you will become a capitalist. You may not want to, but you will become a capitalist. 2 tenets: industry, frugality. Work hard, work without ceasing. Don't spend your money on frivolous things. Save your money. You're going to accumulate capital. And the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay did that. They flourished, they prospered, they did well. But, alas, the Christian Commonwealth failed. And I'm not the one declaring it a failure. The architects declared it a failure. In fact, beginning with the second generation there, not the ones who arrived and designed the Christian Commonwealth, but with their kids, we start hearing sermon after sermon talking about declension. These were called Jeremiads, lamenting that once we were great, once we embraced the Bible and what have you, and now we're declining. In other words, they did what we do and what I recommend that our kids do, and that is you blame the kids for the problems of the adults. We were doing fine, but this generation is screwing it up, so you blame them. But the real problem was a fundamental clash. And it wasn't a clash between believers and secularists. It wasn't a clash between orthodox believers and wild-eyed liberals. Had nothing to do with it. It was a clash between uniformity and dissent. Uniformity and dissent. It was a clash between order and freedom. And let me give you some expression or some examples of when residents started asserting their freedom and got into trouble with the keepers of the order. Number one, that found expression in religious persecution, including that of Baptists. No dissent allowed, except in privacy. Their idea of freedom of conscience, go home and believe whatever you want to believe. But in public, you got to conform. Roger Williams, obviously, and you know that. I don't know, buddy, is he a Baptist or not? I don't know if he's a Baptist. We claim him. He's a good guy. We claim him. I don't care what the other people say. He most eloquently protested against this uniformity, and then John Cotton, a good Puritan divine, defended uniformity. But Williams had this to say, and it's probably familiar to most of you, but I think it bears repeating. All civil states with their officers of justice in their respective constitutions and administrations are essentially civil, and therefore not judges, governors, or defenders of the spiritual or Christian state and worship. And he thought that Massachusetts Bay Colony had a civil government that had way too much to say about religion, about dissenters, and about what happened to him. It is the will and command of God, he continued, that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worship be granted to all men. Did you hear what he said? That everybody, not just people who agreed with Baptists, not just people who agreed with Christians, ought to have the right under God to believe as they will. And then he says this, God requireth not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced by the civil state, which enforced uniformity, sooner or later, is the greatest occasion of civil war. And I think history bears that out. Ravishing consciences, persecution of Jesus Christ in his servants, and of the hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls. An enforced uniformity of religion throughout a nation or civil state confounds the civil and religious, denies the principles of Christianity and civility. Wow. And that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. Words that bear attention today. The second problem that arose, the second attack, was a political attack. Lord Say and Seal, that's one person, Sayesele, was a Puritan sympathizer. He was a Puritan sympathizer in England, and because things were not going so well for him, a dissenter in England, he thought about moving to New England, to Massachusetts. But he was hearing some things about the uniformity in New England that disturbed him. So he sent Winthrop a list of 10 questions to clarify exactly how things were run in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And when he found out that one's civil liberties depended upon one's church, one's standing in a congregation, he said that breaches the English Constitution. I don't want to go to a place where my civil liberties depend upon what visible saints may have to say. That's anti-English, it's anti-constitutional, it's anti-freedom. I want no part of that. Third, and here's where our ultra-conservative friends would trip up over the Massachusetts Christian economy. Principles of free trade. And you know, many of them absolutely worship the free market. Principles of free trade were rejected in favor of Old Testament notions of a moral economy. I'm not saying which is better. I mean, maybe we ought to have a moral economy. But people like a merchant, Robert Kane, who sold some nails at a 50% markup, was hauled first into the civil court and then into the church, saying that he had violated this loving community in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He protested. He said, look, I operate out there in the real world. I operate out there in the English market. Sometimes my ships go to the bottom of the sea. I set my prices not just based on the first cost of the nails that I pay over in England. I got to get them here. I got to insure them. I got to finance them. I got to transport them. I got to pay for losses. So that's what business people do. That's what merchants do. Winthrop called up John Cotton, Reverend Cotton, and said, gee, we got a problem here. Scour the Old Testament and see if you can come up with some laws that will indict this fellow. So Cotton goes into his study, and he comes up with two concepts that he drew from the Old Testament, and that's the concept of the just price and the fair wage. And those were applied retroactively. And poor old Kane was indicted based on these laws that Cotton came up with and applied retroactively. 1684, end of the Holy Commonwealth. Charles II said, look, you people in Massachusetts Bay are acting autonomously. You're violating the Constitution. You violate the Navigation Acts. You're smugglers. You violate the law. No more independence. So he pulled the charter, issued a new royal charter in 1691, And here's the irony. With that new charter, things change in Massachusetts Bay. It's no longer a Christian commonwealth based on religious uniformity. It is now the seedbed of dissent. And when we get to 1776, Edmund, senior moment, Burke, thank you. Edmund Burke is trying to explain the revolution. And you know why? Because from the earliest settlement was settled by the protest of Protestants and the dissidents of dissent. The protest of Protestants and the dissidents of dissent. And I would say to you that the United States, the new republic that was created, followed the lines of freedom and dissent much more than uniformity and order. Okay, I want to leave a little time for questions, but let me close by contrasting Massachusetts Bay Colony, very briefly, we'll return to this in the third lecture, to the Constitution that was drafted in 1787. Now remember, David Barton said, that the delegates in 1787 followed the model of Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Bible. In fact, the delegates granted Congress no power regarding religion. They granted power concerning taxation, trade, what have you, but not religion. It does not mean that the delegates thought religion unimportant. Quite the opposite. They thought religion was very important. They were religious people. They were Christians, with the possible exception of Franklin, who was a deist. These were all confessing Christians. But they didn't create a Christian commonwealth. Rather, they thought religion should be lodged in the hands of the people and that it ought to be put on a voluntary basis. It should not be a department of state. Secondly, the new Constitution prohibited all religious tests for office holders. Thus, civil liberties did not depend upon religious affiliation. And then third, and this isn't directly related, but reflects what was happening in Massachusetts Bay, economic exchange would take place in a free, regulated market, not in a moral economy. Let me close. I've gone longer than I intended to. I'll go shorter this afternoon, so if you come back, you'll have more opportunity for questions. While the evangelical historians today are absolutely certain that the delegates in 1787 created a Christian commonwealth, people at the time did not. William Williams was a merchant and delegate to the Connecticut State Ratifying Convention. When he first saw the Constitution, he was appalled. He looked at the preamble, and he was looking for something closer to his Puritan fathers. He suggested a new preamble. We, the people of the United States, in a firm belief of the being and perfections of the one living and true God, the creator and supreme governor of the world, in his universal providence and the authority of his laws, so on and so forth. Didn't pass, but you can see where he's coming from. 1812, July 4, 1812, President of Yale, Timothy Dwight, had this to say. At the end of War of Independence, the delegates met and formed our Constitution without any acknowledgement of God, without any recognition of his mercies to us as a people, of his government, or even of his existence. The Constitutional Convention by which it was formed never asked even once his direction or his blessing upon their labors. So let me wind it up. Was the United States created as a Christian state? I think the evidence says certainly that was not the case if we're looking at the creation of the Federal Republic in 1787. Now, there's a different question, and that is the United States, or has it ever been, a Christian nation? That is, apart from the state apparatus. Is it a Christian nation? And I submit to you that that is going to be always in the hands of the people. And if the people want it to be a Christian nation, it will be a Christian nation. But I can say this, and this is a segue into, or an introduction of what we'll talk about this afternoon, that from the beginning, the United States has been deeply secular and deeply sacred. And those two have often been in tension. They still are in tension. And so to say that the United States is either secular or sacred, I think, is to distort the past. Thank you. Do we have time for any questions? I'll entertain any questions, comments, assaults. Remember, I punted, I still punt, so yeah.
What one person in history has had the greatest positive influence on religious liberty?
That's an interesting question. You know, a few years ago, I think probably most historians would instantly answer, oh, well, probably Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Certainly they were instrumental, and I think they were important. You can mention Roger Williams. And I'm not just playing to my audience here. I would say the dissenters of Virginia between 1776 and 1785. I would say the Baptists, the Presbyterians, but primarily the Baptists. The Presbyterians, at one time, I'm giving away something, but at one time the Presbyterians, in the fight for religious liberty in Virginia, bought into the notion that, okay, we will go along with the idea of establishment if you let us in on some of the revenue. Baptists never went down that path. And in fact, the Baptists said to Thomas Jefferson and those people who wanted the support of those dissenters, we'll support you in the War of Independence, but we've got an agenda too, and that is we want independence from the state. We want separation of church and state. So I would say, it may not be what you're looking for, I would say collectively, people like those Baptists in Virginia. Other questions? Yes?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I'd like your reaction to this observation. Could it be the case that some of the reaction against the metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state that we see today, primarily on the right, is a reaction against a misconception of what separation of church and state means, and it's a misconception driven by some on the radical left who have argued that separation of church and state requires that religion play no role in public life.
I think you're exactly right. You know, and indeed, you know, we talk about that metaphor, the wall of separation. James Madison actually talked about the line of separation, and he called it a shifting line. That might be closer to reality. But no, I think you're right. I don't think there was any intention that, gee, religion wouldn't play a part in public life. And, you know, we should not confuse separation of church and state as a constitutional principle from religion and politics. I mean, religion is in politics. You know, religious people vote. Religious people run for office. So it's in politics. You don't get it out. No, I think you're right. And let me comment on something you said in your introduction that really strikes a chord. You know, I hear people talk about, and of course, you build straw men. If you want to make a case, you build straw men. And one of the straw men is, gee, these liberal justices using this one little phrase by Thomas Jefferson has taken prayer out of school and religion out of the public square and what have you. I say to my students sometimes, you know, prayer has always been in schools. It's in school now. In fact, I say to my students, I wish you would pray a little less and study a little more. But the issue always is, by those who advocate prayer in school, I want my prayer in school. You know, that's what I want. You know, it's not that, gee, we encourage everybody to talk about it. And one other thing in that line, I really regret that we're so litigious that religion has pretty much disappeared from the curriculum.
We are dismissed and hope to see everyone back at 5 o'clock right here tonight. Thank you.